They found the crib first. Charred, half sunk in the mud behind the house, its wooden ribs blackened and warped, like the skeleton of something that had tried to crawl away. Inside it lay a single thing, a lock of pale hair, fused to the ash. No bones, no body, just that hair and the faint smell of oil, the kind used in lanterns or sacrifices. The sheriff said lightning must have struck the house, but those who'd seen the sky that night swore it was clear. No clouds, no storm, only the low hum of crickets and something else beneath it, a kind of whisper that came from the earth itself. The farmhouse had stood for nearly a century, built before the Great War, and even then people said it felt wrong. Its walls leaned inward, as if the house were trying to listen. Every board was carved with initials, dozens of them, though no one alive remembered those names. And in the cellar, there was a table, long and low, its surface worn smooth by hands and years of prayer. But prayer wasn't what stained it. The coroner wouldn't say what he found there. He just left the basement and vomited in the yard. When they searched the ashes, they found 12 teeth, too small to belong to an adult, too old to belong to a newborn. There were no skulls, no limbs, nothing whole, as if whatever burned had done so from the inside out. One deputy swore he heard a cry under the rubble, soft, rhythmic, almost like breathing. He dug until his finger split. But the sound stopped when he said her name aloud. There was a girl once. Her name had been wiped from record. But the old women remembered her. They said she was born during a blood moon and never cried. Not once, not even at birth. They said her mother vanished before the first frost. That's all anyone dared to recall. If you drive through the valley today, you can still see the outline where the house once stood. An impression of walls in the soil, like bones beneath skin. Locals don't stop there. They don't look. But sometimes, when the wind cuts through the hollow just right, you can hear something creak. Not wood, not metal, something older. Which city are you watching from? And what time is it right now? The land was called Briar County once, before it disappeared from the state maps in 1952. It wasn't erased, just left behind. The way a body leaves behind a shadow after it burns. Old surveyors' journals mention it only in fragments. Notes smudged by rain or fear, soil black as coal. One wrote, "Rivers run wrong direction." Another, years later, simply scribbled, "Voices at night." Briar County sat along the Kentucky-Tennessee line, tucked between ridges so steep the sun could barely reach the ground. They said time moved slower there. Clocks rusted before they stopped, calendars curled at the corners before the year was through. People didn't move in or out much, and those who did rarely stayed long enough to tell anyone why they'd left. Before it was called Briar, the land belonged to one family. The Holloways, settlers who'd arrived before the Civil War, carrying with them only a wagon, a book of homemade scripture, and a promise that their blood would never mix with strangers. "We are the root," their patriarch had written, and roots must not wander. It was meant as faith, but it became law. A law that bred silence, then sickness, then something worse. By the 1900s, the Holloways were a rumor even to their neighbors. The census skipped them. The church forgot them. But the hills remembered. Children from nearby towns whispered that if you followed the river far enough, you'd find their house, a white, sagging structure with smoke that never rose, only sank. In 1949, a missionary passed through the area and noted in his field diary a peculiar girl, seen gathering water alone, her face pale as flour. He wrote, "Her belly swollen, though she could not be more than 12. He asked the locals who she was. No one answered. They only looked down, chewing their tongues until they bled. The missionary left the next morning and never returned. His car was found weeks later, half buried in silt, with the words "TURNBACK" scratched into the windshield from the inside. By autumn, Briar County was gone. Flooded. Some say, after the state dammed the valley. But others whisper the ground gave way from underneath, swallowing the hollow hole. Either way, the Holloways vanished. But the girl, they say she didn't drown. She walked out. She came from the water at dawn, barefoot, wrapped in the tatters of a cotton shift. Her eyes were pale, colorless, like glass washed too many times in river silt. The fisherman who found her said she didn't speak, didn't cry, didn't even shiver though the morning frost cut through her skin. When he tried to lift her, she only stared, through him, not at him, then turned her gaze back toward the valley where the river vanished. They took her to town, or what was left of it. The war had emptied the streets, the mines had taken the rest. There was no doctor, only a widow who'd birthed 9 children and buried 7. She washed the girl's feet, wrapped her in wool, and asked her name. The child only pressed a finger to her lips, as if silencing the world itself. So they called her Eliza Holloway. After the family, no one would mention, but everyone remembered. Eliza grew quiet among the living. She ate when told, slept when told, but never prayed. At night, the widow said she'd wake to find the girl standing at the window, watching the woods. Some mornings, she'd find her outside, barefoot again, her hair damp with dew, staring into the fog. She listens. The widow said once, like the earth is whispering secrets meant only for her. By her 10th year, she began drawing. Charcoal on walls, soot on floorboards, circles, always circles, sometimes with eyes inside them, sometimes with something that looked like teeth. When asked, she'd murmur, "They're watching back." The widow painted over them, but each night they returned, darker, deeper, carved into the wood instead of drawn. Animals started dying that winter. First the hens, then the hound. No marks, no struggle, just stillness. The widow said their eyes were missing. One morning, she found Eliza sitting beside the hound's body, humming. The same soft melody every time, slow, ancient. The kind of tune that sounds like it's been sung for generations without anyone remembering where it began. The townsfolk grew wary. Some said she was cursed, others said she was what the Holloways had been trying to keep in, not out. A few believed she wasn't a child at all, that whatever had come out of the flooded valley wore a girl's skin. But beneath it was something older, colder, patient. And when the widow fell sick in the spring, coughing black into her palms, Eliza didn't weep. She only whispered, "The roots remember." After the widow died, the preacher tried to take Eliza in. He said, no child should sleep in an empty house. He brought her to the church on the hill, fed her stew, and made her sit through sermons she never seemed to hear. During prayers, her lips would move, but not with the congregation. Words no one recognized. Syllables that curled like smoke, low and deliberate. He asked where she'd learned them. She said her mother taught her before the fire. The preacher went pale. Everyone knew what fire she meant. He searched for her family in the archives, but Briar County's records had all been lost in the flood. Births, deaths, marriages, all gone. Only one scrap survived, a ledger fragment from 1911, water, stained and brittle. It listed 12 Holloways, all sharing the same surname, all born within 2 years of each other. No mothers named, no fathers, just initials beside ages that made no sense. He closed the book and locked it away. That night, Something knocked on the church door 3 times. When he opened it, no one was there, only mud, thick and black, smeared across the threshold. The next Sunday, Eliza refused to come inside. She stood beneath the window, eyes fixed on the altar, whispering again. The preacher said he heard his own name in that whisper, drawn out and wrong, as if spoken from underwater. He tried to bless her, to break whatever shadow she carried, but his hand trembled before he could touch her. A week later, he was found in his study. The Bible on his desk split down the spine, its pages burned around a single verse, and the root shall bear the fruit of its own kind. His mouth was filled with soil. After that, no one claimed Eliza. She returned to the widow's house, which now smelled of mold and damp wood. She lit candles in every window, though no one had taught her how. At night, people saw the lights flicker in patterns. 3, pause, 3 again. Like breathing. One boy dared to go near the house, said he wanted proof. He came back before sunrise, silent, eyes glassy, with a mark on his arm that looked like a handprint burned into the skin. When his mother asked what he saw, he only said, "She's waiting for them to come home." The town started to rot after that. Wells soared. Fields grew fungus that glittered in moonlight, and somewhere under that earth, something moved. Slow, deliberate, hungry. By 1953, Eliza had stopped aging. At least that's what people said. 5 years had passed since the flood. Yet she looked the same, thin, her hair the color of straw left too long in the sun. The sheriff who replaced the last one called her the Hollow Girl. He meant it as a joke, but he didn't laugh when he saw her eyes. They had no reflection, as though the world refused to appear in them. A state inspector arrived that spring to assess the valley for resettlement. He'd heard the rumors, dismissed them as superstition until he found the Holloway cemetery. The headstones were carved from river rock, most without names, but one bore a single word, etched deep enough to cut through stone dust, Motushiar. The date beneath it was 1864. The soil around it was disturbed, freshly turned. He marked the coordinates in his logbook and moved on. The logbook was found months later beside the road, pages waterlogged, ink washed into blue veins. Locals said Eliza visited that grave every new moon. They said she spoke to the dirt as if it were breathing back. Some nights, they heard her singing, the same melody the widow had once heard by her bed. But the song wasn't mournful. It was reverent, worshipful, and sometimes, when the wind carried it just right, you could hear another voice beneath hers. The schoolteacher, one of the last in town, tried to make sense of it. She kept notes, mapping the old family names, tracing marriages that never left the same bloodline. Her conclusion was unpublishable. The Holloways had folded their lineage in on itself, so tightly that parent and child, brother and sister, had become indistinguishable. Generations of the same blood passing between the same bodies. She brought her findings to the sheriff. He burned them without reading. Said he wouldn't invite that kind of talk. Said it wasn't Christian. A week later, the teacher went missing. Her house was found open, the lamp still burning. Her shoes by the door. On her wall, carved deep into the plaster, were the same circles Eliza used to draw. Only this time, they were connected by lines. Not random, not childish, a map. Each line intersected at one name, E. H. When they searched the woods for her, they found a clearing. 12 stones arranged in a spiral, and in the center, buried just beneath the moss, lay a lock of hair, pale, unburned. The sheriff sealed the site by dawn. He told the men never to speak of what they'd seen, but secrets rot slower than flesh. The town began to thin, like meat boiled too long. Families left without farewell, wagons drawn at night, windows boarded from the inside. Those who stayed learned not to mention her name. But silence, once taught, grows its own language. And in Briar County's ghost, the silence became scripture. By autumn, the wells had soared again. Frogs surfaced, belly gut. Milk curdled hours after dawn. The old postmaster, a man of reason, took it upon himself to cleanse the town's superstition. He gathered the churchman, the blacksmith, and the remaining miners, and together they went to the Holloway house. They said they'd burn what should have been buried. But when they reached the property, they found no house, no path. Only the skeleton of the valley itself. Trees grey and brittle, soil wet with something thicker than water. The air stank of iron. They turned back before sundown. All except the postmaster. He stayed. Said he saw her standing by the creek, barefoot, hands clasped, humming. He returned the next day, clothes damp, eyes sunken. Carrying an object wrapped in burlap. He refused to show anyone what it was. Locked himself in his office, muttering that the blood remembers. On the third day, the office caught fire. Nothing inside survived except the burlap, now empty. In the weeks that followed, strange births began to occur among the cattle. Calves born with fused spines. Lambs with two heads that wouldn't open their eyes. The preacher called it pestilence. The midwives called it inheritance. But none dared name the source. Children started to vanish then, one by one. Always at night, always barefoot. No screams, no struggle, just absence. The sheriff searched the woods, found small footprints circling the same clearing of stones. Each print pressed deeper than the last, as though the ground itself had been swallowing them whole, and then the singing returned. Low at first, carried through fog. The same tune that had haunted the widow's house years before. By winter, it echoed through the entire valley. Folks said it came from nowhere and everywhere, sometimes a mile off, sometimes at the foot of the bed. Some claimed they saw a figure walking through the frost, her hair white as ash, her eyes hollow lanterns in the dark. Those who left never spoke again of Briar County. Those who stayed were never seen again. And in the center of it all, under a moon that refused to rise, the soil began to move. Slow, deliberate, like something breathing just beneath. In 1984, nearly 30 years after Briar County had slipped off every record, a researcher named Thomas Graves came looking for it. He was no believer, only a genealogist tracing anomalies in state birth archives. 12 names, all ending in Holloway, all born on the same day, generations apart. He thought it a clerical error, a duplication. He was wrong. Thomas arrived with maps, microfilm, and a reel-to-reel recorder. The locals warned him the valley didn't exist anymore, that it had drowned beneath the dam. But the old ones at the edge of town said otherwise. They said the water never truly covered it, that at low tide you could still see the tip of a roof, the bones of chimneys rising like teeth. One woman, half-blind and shaking, told him to stay away from the stones. She meant the spiral, though she never said the word. On his second night, he reached the dry bed of the old river. The mud was cracked like skin, the air heavy with something metallic. He found a foundation, shallow and wide, charred along one side. He thought it was a barn until he saw the cradle shape etched into the limestone. He brushed away dirt, uncovered marks beneath it. Handprints, small, layered, hundreds of them, the kind a child makes when reaching for light. He recorded everything. His tape captures the sound of his breath, his footsteps, and then something else. A faint lullaby, distant at first, then nearer, the same melody described by witnesses in 1949. The tape ends there, with a whisper so low it's almost lost in the static. The root still lives. 3 days later, park rangers found his camp torn apart. No signs of struggle, no animal tracks, only the recorder half, buried in the silt. Its reels spinning though the batteries were dead. The tent had been marked with a single circle drawn in soot, connected to a smaller one by a thin, jagged line. His belongings were catalogued and sent to the university. Among them, a fragment of wood carved with the initials EH and beneath them, a datey 1984. The carving was fresh. The department closed the file as accidental disappearance. But one of his students, years later, listened to the tape again, slowed it down, and swore she heard a second voice under Thomas's own. A girl, whispering the same phrase he'd written in his notes. The blood remembers. And somewhere in the valley, the water began to recede. By 1991, the dam's foundations had begun to fail. Engineers blamed the soil, too soft, too unstable. But the locals who still lived nearby said the water was rejecting what had been buried beneath it. Fish surfaced belly up, eyes clouded, their scales stripped in spirals. The smell of iron and rot bled through the valley, and then, at night, the lights began, thin, white flickers moving beneath the surface like candles drifting against the current. Some said it was trapped air. Others said it was her. A state crew came to drain part of the reservoir for maintenance. When the waterline fell 20 feet, the outline of a house appeared, its frame warped, its chimney leaning like a crooked finger. Reporters came, though most turned back after sunset. One, a young woman named Sarah, stayed behind. Her camera caught the first reflection. She described it later, her voice trembling. A girl standing in the shallows, barefoot, hair floating around her like a halo of smoke. "She wasn't looking at me," Sarah said. "She was looking through the lens, as if she knew what it was." The girl raised a hand, and the water behind her rippled outward, though there was no wind. Then the camera stopped. The last image on the roll showed nothing but the reflection. No girl, just the shape of a cradle, black and glimmering under the water's skin. Sarah left the valley that night and never returned. Within a month, her negatives vanished from the archive. Her editor found her apartment empty, walls scrubbed clean except for a single phrase written in charcoal above the sink, "Mother waits below." In the years that followed, sightings multiplied. Travelers claimed to see a pale figure by the roadside, humming. Children dreamed of a woman in a burlap veil who touched their foreheads and whispered names they didn't know. Every story different, yet always the same melody. Always the same silence afterward. When the dam finally broke in 1997, the flood tore through 3 counties. No bodies were recovered. Only trees stripped bare, fences twisted into wreaths. And, in the debris, a cradle made of limestone, unbroken. They moved it to a museum in Lexington. But the curator resigned within a week, said it sang at night. The exhibit was sealed, labeled Artifact 12B. No visitors allowed, but janitors whispered that sometimes, when the lights dimmed, a faint voice rose from the stone. Not in words, but in breath, soft, rhythmic, like something remembering how to be born again. The cradle sits in the museum's basement now, behind glass too thick for sound to travel. At least, that's what the engineers promised. Visitors don't see it anymore. The exhibit was quietly removed from the main floor after a night guard went missing. His shift log ended at 2:17 a.m. With 3 words, "It moved again." They found his flashlight beside the display, beam flickering across a smear on the inside of the case. The glass wasn't broken. It was softened, warped like wax too near a flame. Beneath it, The cradle was empty. The director ordered the room sealed. But the next morning, the security footage showed water pooling under the door, seeping from nowhere, then retreating just before dawn. Maintenance called it condensation. The janitor refused to enter again. He said the puddle spelled a word: home. A year later, the museum closed for renovation. The cradle was shipped to storage, but when the crate arrived, it was filled with soil, black, damp, and warm. No stone, no explanation. The shipping label read "Return to Briar County." No such county exists anymore. The maps were redrawn, the name erased. But in satellite images, there's a dark hollow in the forest where no vegetation grows. Locals avoid the area. Hunters say they hear singing when the wind changes direction. In 2021, a survey drone passed over the hollow. The footage was never released publicly, but a technician who saw it described the shape revealed beneath the canopy. 12 stones in a spiral, circling something pale at the center. He swore it was breathing. They shut down the project after that. But even now, on cold nights, when the power hums low and the dark feels too alive, some claim to hear her song again. Soft, patient waiting, not a warning, but a calling. Because the Holloways never died. They just went inward, folded themselves into the root of the world, waiting for the soil to crack open. And if you listen long enough, you can hear it, the sound of the earth remembering. Slow, deliberate, hungry, the end.